Have you ever wanted to play one of your classic games from your childhood, only to either not having the working console for it anymore, or maybe your game copy got corrupted, lost, or destroyed? Perhaps you want to relive your days as a Pokemon expert, but legally buying a new console and a copy of the game is both expensive and hard to come by. Well, there is a solution to this, but there is a caveat. Its legality is somewhat complicated. Let's dive deeper into game emulation, its history and many lawsuits, and try to understand why it's so important for the preservation of games. Game emulation has been around for a long time, but it didn't really gain proper traction until the early to mid 1990s. In this time period, CPU speeds increased, the internet got better and faster, and the market for emulators grew. The early history of emulators is a bit murky, but most of them could generally only emulate a few games and with limited functionality. They were basically oftentimes buggy, either lacking sound or not being able to emulate the game in real time. One of the challenges of emulating games is that in order to actually do it properly, it requires a deep understanding of how the game console worked. Let's say you wanted to create a NES emulator. Well, you need to know exactly what CPU was used, how the console circuitry interfaced with the various hardware, what sound chip was used, and how the game interacted with it. Long story short, you need extensive information that was generally not available to the public. This made game emulation very difficult, and a lot of the work put into early emulators essentially became guesswork. Most developers basically had to do their own reverse engineering of the hardware and try to emulate that behavior. Over the years, more and more enthusiasts have been hard at work, completely reverse engineering consoles, their inner workings, and providing extensive documentation of it. This extensive understanding of the console and games provided other developers with a strong foundation to start emulating games properly. If you're interested in a deep dive into how these emulators are made, JavidX9 has a video series of him making a NES emulator from scratch that I highly recommend watching. Although it goes far into the realm of programming and understanding of CPUs, it conveys just how much effort are put into making these emulators. Over the coming years, emulators became better and better, but unfortunately, with that success and the rise of piracy because of the internet, came lawsuits and new rules for digital content. One big problem with physical media is that they can degrade over time. Everything from an old NES cartridge to that CD copy you have of Medal of Honor will not last forever. The rate at how fast this happens depends on a variety of factors, but generally speaking, humidity, heat, and exposure to the sun poses serious risks. So while your game from 2008 might not be in any immediate trouble, old cartridges from the 1980s and CDs from the 90s are gradually risking more and more degradation. For games that sold millions of copies, there are still tons of copies out there and most of them have been digitized already. But sadly, that is not true for a ton of other lesser known games. So if you used to own a copy of a game from way back in the NES era and your physical copy is gone or degraded, and you can't legally buy a copy of it anymore, you're out of luck. On top of that, most developers have not done a good job providing us with alternative ways to buy a copy of older games. Another obvious problem with physical media is that you can simply lose it. So if a game back in the 80s only sold a couple of 100,000 copies and wasn't too popular, it can become next to impossible to get a copy of it today. According to the Video Game History Foundation, 87% of American video games released before 2010 are out of print and cannot be acquired outside of the grey market or piracy. Many of these titles are in danger of becoming lost, or already are. A lot of gamers feel that the publishers have a huge responsibility to make these games available out of respect for the developers, players, and to preserve history. The legality of emulation is a bit complicated. Generally speaking, the emulators themselves aren't illegal, but distributing or downloading game copies are. So even though you own a legal copy of a game, you can't just download a ROM from the internet, because that is still technically illegal. You are, however, generally permitted to take backups of your copies for personal use. The problem with this is, especially for older games, it's not easy to actually create backups. Nintendo, for instance, has never officially provided a solution for backing up game cartridges. In order to do so, you'd have to purchase a third-party device and dump the cartridge contents yourself. So if your game copy of Super Mario Bros. That has been collecting dust in your attic for decades doesn't work anymore, the simplest quote-unquote legal solution then would be to buy it at an incredibly inflated price on eBay or frantically search the internet for someone selling it for a reasonable price. If the developers isn't digitizing the game, someone else has to, so it doesn't disappear forever. So you might be asking, how the hell are we supposed to play old games without breaking any laws? Well, we would either need to digitally back them up ourselves, although that might be a bit late in 2025, or we have to rely on the developer, Nintendo in this case, to re-release the game digitally. As you probably know, this has not been the case for a long time, although Nintendo has started doing so in recent years. But once they actually do provide you with a digital copy of the game, they usually only do so for the most popular games. There are tons of older games that are essentially dead and nowhere to be found legally. The only way to play these obscure and lesser known games is to illegally download them. This creates a difficult situation where you're essentially forced to break the law in order to play that game from your childhood you have such fond memories of. Oh, and by the way, as a side note here, in modern console emulators like the PS2, the emulator often requires you to provide it with the console's BIOS. The BIOS is essentially a subsystem of the operating system and provides the operating system with important features that I just won't elaborate on here. But the point is that the BIOS suffers from the same problem as game copying does. It can legally be dumped and stored for personal usage, but the tools for doing so is often complicated and requires a working console. So the bottom line is that you can't legally download the BIOS from someone else, even if you own a working console that has the exact same BIOS on it now. Now, as I said earlier, the legality of backing up your own copy of software is complicated and it can differ significantly depending on the country you live in, so just keep that in mind. In recent years, we've seen an increase in remakes and remasters, which you could argue is better than nothing, I guess, but for a lot of these re-release titles, it just isn't the same as the original. A perfect example of this is the Crash Bandicoot trilogy remake. The games themselves are actually pretty good, and the developer made a pretty good job mimicking the original gameplay feel, but most of the graphical quirks and what made it stand out are just lost. It also feels a little insincere getting remake after remake year after year. Most people would probably rather have a sequel or new IPs instead of game companies constantly exploiting the nostalgia we have for these older games. In my opinion, remasters are better than remakes, because if I can play something as close to the original game as possible, on Steam for example, the exact same version of the game I grew up with, but just optimized for PC or a newer console, I'd rather play that. Older games had huge limitations because of the current hardware they had available, and some games even leaned into this limitation and emphasized it. This gave games quirks that are simply lost when they're remade from the ground up, which to me is a very important thing because history is lost. Yeah, sure, you've remade the game, but the original artwork is gone. The original work, the original ingenuity, it's all gone. There are tons of documentaries online about how older games used hardware tricks and different techniques to make the game playable, and it's usually what just made the game what it was. Ars Technica has a small documentary on Crash Bandicoot and how they actually circumvented a lot of the limitations, and I highly recommend you watch it because it's really interesting and it just goes to show you how much work was put into it and how big of a disservice it is to remake the game. Over the years, there have been countless lawsuits where game companies have tried taking down major emulator providers and ROM distributors. There are far too many to go into in this video, but we'll look at some notable ones here. Love ROMs and Love Retro. These websites were run by an Arizona couple and contained thousands of ROMs, including games for classic consoles like the NES, SNES, and Game Boy. In 2018, Nintendo filed a lawsuit against the couple and accused them of brazen and mass-scale piracy of Nintendo's intellectual property. They were accused of both copyright and trademark infringement. Nintendo won the lawsuit and the Arizona couple had to shut down both sites immediately. They originally wanted $150,000 per game on the site and $2 million for each trademark infringement. This would have quickly added up to hundreds of millions of dollars, but the court settled for a consent judgment of about $12 million instead. Reports indicate that the couple didn't actually have to pay that amount, but that it was just a symbolic sum to deter other providers. Following this lawsuit, most ROM providers were shocked and found it way too risky to continue operating. Emu Paradise, for instance, shut down their website as a direct result of the lawsuit against the Arizona couple. In 2019, Nintendo sued ROM Universe, and the results were pretty much the same as with the Arizona couple case. In 2021, Nintendo won the lawsuit against ROM Universe, and the owner had to pay about $2.1 million. In 2023, Nintendo filed a lawsuit against the developer of Yuzu, a Switch emulator for PC. For years, Switch emulators like Yuzu and its counterpart, Ryujinx, operated in a legal gray area, generally avoiding Nintendo's copyrighted code. However, Nintendo alleged that these emulators facilitated circumvention of the Switch's security and contributed to piracy of Switch games, especially with high-profile leaks of new titles. In mid-2023, Nintendo filed a lawsuit against at least one prominent Yuzu developer, identified by the handle Tropic Haze, seeking to shut down the emulator's development. This came on the heels of Nintendo pressuring Valve to remove the Dolphin emulator from Steam and reportedly taking other action against Switch emulation. Ultimately, the case was won by Nintendo, and every single trace of the emulator was quickly erased from the internet, and the developer also actually had to give their domain to Nintendo. So after looking through the legal aspects and while doing research for this video, I can understand why companies like Nintendo are so eager to crack down on ROM sites and certain emulators. They're losing tons of money, and a lot of these ROM providers are in fact breaking the law, but the lengths they go to in order to kill these ROM sites and emulators is just a bit hard for me to find justified. I mean, when you see tons of these sites pop up, then maybe you should start realizing that there's demand there. A lot of the games that got removed are classic games that are just really hard to come by today, and when companies like Nintendo doesn't want to provide us with legitimate ways of purchasing legal copies, it's hard to feel bad for them. If publishers keep waging this war against ROM sites without providing a legal channel to buy them, then most of them will eventually disappear completely. I have this utopia in mind that I think would benefit both sides. What if Nintendo started selling ROMs for a cheap price? Why can't Nintendo develop software to emulate games and then sell consumers copies of the ROMs? I mean, it's a win-win. Nintendo earns money, people get to play their beloved childhood games, and the ROMs are preserved. Nintendo has done something similar by releasing the Nintendo Classic Mini, which is just a modernized NES console that has like 30 games pre-installed on it. But there are still tons of games out there that aren't available. Now look, I'm in no way condoning piracy here, but looking at the current landscape, there still aren't nearly enough coverage from publishers to satiate the demand for these older titles. Unfortunately, emulation is just a necessary evil for the preservation of games, and if the publishers won't provide us with a solution, the community has to find one. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you liked it. Please feel free to discuss this topic with me further in the comment section. This is something I'm really passionate about, and I would love to hear your feedback and opinions on this. But with that, I'm Rolf, and I hope you have an amazing day.